Committee will now come to order, please. We have minutes from January 11th, 12th, and 13th for approval. Can I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Representative Riley, seconded. Any discussion on the minutes? If not, all those approve of the minutes signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed, no. The minutes are passed. Be published. Thank you. Second order of business. Are there any bill introductions? Seeing none, we'll move on. We are honored today to have a special guest, Mr. Rob Mannis, Director of the Nature Conservancy. He is going to give us an update on what they do and possibly a hint of maybe some help with some funding. With that, Mr. Mannis, welcome to the committee. Turn on the microphone.
You got the thank you part, right? Okay. Yeah. Nice to see you all this morning. I got up this morning and I was putting everything in my pickup and put on a coat and left my sport coat in, so if I appear to be underdressed for the occasion, that's why. It's still on the bed in the bedroom. So we found the PowerPoint. Thank you very much. Yeah, I don't know how I'd do any kind of meeting or talk without a PowerPoint anymore. It seems impossible. What's not in the PowerPoint is, by the way, I really appreciate the chance to do this. What's not in the PowerPoint is just I'll tell you a little bit about me. Some of you I've met before, but most important thing I can tell you is I'm a father of 4 kids, age range 33 to one who turns 11 today. So it's a very bad business plan, a really bad retirement plan. I've lived in Kansas almost my entire life, with short stints in Missouri, Arizona, and California, believe it or not. Did most of my growing up in Pratt and Ellsworth counties. Ellsworth County, most of my family are farmers, ranchers, and school teachers there. So it's a pretty pedestrian beginning. I grew up hunting and fishing, mostly in the somewhere around the banks of the Smoky Hill River in Ellsworth County and the Nenaskaw River in Pratt County, a couple of pretty fine places. I went to Kansas State University as an undergrad and Friends University, the Fighting Falcons. I didn't know Quakers had any fighting anything, but there I studied biology and education. And at K-State, I learned about work ethic. I also learned about the importance of people in the equation of ecosystems and biology. And I suppose the fact that I was also an education major explains that I had a little affinity towards people to begin with. But anyway, that's a little bit about who I am. You can ask my kids if you want to know the truth. Representative Highland lives close enough that he can do that anytime. The Nature Conservancy, hey, we got the slide up. Thank you. The Nature Conservancy is a 75-year-old nonprofit organization. We've been in Kansas about 37 years, I think. One of the things that attracted me to work for the Nature Conservancy, I've been in conservation for almost 41 years. I started when I was 2. One of the things that attracted me to it is the fact that it has a very people-centric mission. So we're not a people conservation organization, but we consider it to be essential to our business plan to do our work in a way that benefits people and economies and families and communities and cultures, along with our nature conservation. And that's not an altogether altruistic way of doing business. It's very much about making sure that what we do works. It's about making sure that when people at some point down the road need to feed their kids or pay college tuition or make a mortgage payment, they don't undo what we do, because economics is going to trump everything pretty much every time. So just a little bit more about the Nature Conservancy before we go to the next slide, Amari. We're very much grounded in science. We always try to use the best available science. Sometimes it's not very good, but we try to use the best we can get our hands on. We're also pretty proud of, and I'm aware that pride goeth before a fall, but we're pretty proud of our adherence to integrity also. And we have often, I will tell you that we've given away a lot of money. The Nature Conservancy in Kansas, which is not a wealthy organization, has given away a lot of money to protect our integrity. We figure we live to fight another day if our reputation stays solid. And then the last thing I'd mention is that we're a whole lot about collaboration. We believe that if we work with groups that may not have exactly the same view of things that we do, that we learn, they learn, and we get more done, and it lasts longer. So you'll find us working with organizations that aren't necessarily affiliated in a lot of people's minds with environmentalism or conservation. So today I just want to visit a little bit with you a little bit more about what we do in Kansas and about our organization, and then I want to talk a little bit about an initiative for conservation funding that we've been talking about for a couple of years in Kansas, and we haven't shared it with you all because we didn't want to burden you with the details, and we don't know the details. There's that little fact. You might know the Nature Conservancy in Kansas. Would you go back to the previous slide? I'm sorry. Our mission down there is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends, and I would emphasize that word all, because we mean everything from soil invertebrates to bald eagles to the people in this room when we say all life. Now you go ahead, Omar, thank you. Our priorities, we're a global organization, by the way. We're in, I think, 72 or 3 or 4 countries, something like that, all over Latin America and Canada. Every state in the U.S., not much of Europe, but a little bit, Africa. And we're organized around business units, and we're kind of a tight confederation of somewhat independent business units. So in the U.S., most states are their own unit, and you sink or swim financially on your own. You make your own policy decisions on your own. We're not big into lobbying, but we do get involved in policy some, like I'm going to talk about today. In Kansas, we're funded about 1/3 by membership dues, about 1/3 by philanthropic contributions, and about 1/3 from revenues from lands that we own and operate. And our business, the Conservancy's business model when they first started was find we were protecting cool places from bad stuff. That was our business model. What that meant was we'd find a piece of ecologically unique and important land that was under threat of some sort of development, and we'd buy it and manage it. Turns out that's not a real good business model for modern times. For one thing, land's too expensive. Your money doesn't go far enough. The other thing is we don't want to be in the land management business everywhere. We would rather work with other land managers, other water managers, and achieve our outcomes with the efforts and expertise and, frankly, the resources of ranchers and farmers and commercial landowners. So that's much more what we do now. I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail in a minute. Our priorities, number one, we're a nature conservation organization. That's what we do all day, every day. We work a lot in the agricultural realm, and I'll just tell you right now, we're just figuring out even who we need to work with in agriculture right now. We're very interested in it. We're involved in an effort in the Rattlesnake Creek Basin that you may have heard of, trying to keep the lawyers and the litigators out of it and resolve a problem without lawsuits or even regulation. Working with farmers there. We're also very involved in renewable energy. And I know that's a controversial issue, but you may have heard of a program or a system called Sight Wind Right. And basically what that is an effort to use science to figure out where wind energy should be sited with respect to people, with respect to nature, with respect to landscapes, economies, our need for energy. To use science to do that as opposed to emotion, which is, there's a lot of emotion around renewable energy development. And that program was developed here in Kansas, along with our colleagues from Oklahoma. It was piloted in Kansas, Oklahoma, and the Texas Panhandle. Very successful. The wind industry seemed to like it. Utilities liked it. And it's now this program that we started here in Kansas, which happened with a really scientific conversation that went like this. The Nature Conservancy was on one side of the table and wind energy developers were on the other side, and they said, where don't you want wind? And we said, well, we don't know for sure. but we don't have perfect science, so we don't want to put any circles on a map. And they said, okay, good, we didn't want any circles anyway. From there, it went on to this system that's now spread across the entire wind belt in the United States. Utilities use it, many wind developers use it, and it's been really successful. The good news, the short of it is, there is about 7 times as much good place to put wind in the wind belt of the United States, 19 states, as anybody will ever want for the development of wind and solar energy. So if you use the science, there's plenty of places to do it. And I'll come back to that as much as you want to. Last thing I'll mention here is water. The Nature Conservancy in Kansas has been way, way behind on being involved in water conservation. I feel like I should apologize for that, but I don't know what I would have done differently to date. But we're trying to get into the game now. So I'll talk a little bit more in detail about that. Can I have the next slide, please? So just a little bit more about us here in Kansas. Where we work, the colored blobs are areas that we think are most ecologically important in Kansas, and the yellow dots are places where we have some investment. Frequently, most of those dots are frankly privately owned land. We don't have a land ownership there. We might have a conservation easement. The big dot way out west is Smoky Valley Ranch, and if you go to the next slide, please. Some of the big dots are, you may have heard of Kansa Research Preserve. We own that. Kansas State University operates it with very little oversight and involvement from us. They do a great job. It's one of the most important grazing and fire research locations on the entire planet. People travel from all over the world to study grasslands at Kansa. Really proud of our affiliation with Kansas State University there, because every man's a wildcat, right? Next slide, please. You might know about the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve. I mentioned partnership and collaboration as being part of our business model before. We own the entire Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve except for the 40 acres of where the buildings are in the middle that the National Park Service owns. We aren't really good at historic preservation and interpretation, so we don't want that. We manage it in concert with them, and I would just tell you that we have held very firmly on to fire management there, managing the bison and the cattle grazing on it. Because we think we're better at that than the National Park Service, and we want to get along with our neighbors. We figure if what we do isn't relevant to our neighbors, then it's not going to advance our mission. So, next slide, please.
Yeah, I feel like I've been not fair to my committee members.
So I think we have.
I didn't say that. Yeah, no extra charge though. How many of you been to Little Jerusalem Badlands State Park? Pretty cool place. Yeah, pretty cool place. Just a quick story about that. The family that owned that, we've been talking to them for about 10 years. You know, if you ever want to sell it, we'd be interested in buying it because it's a really cool place. One day, one of the brothers called me and said, "We're ready to sell it. We'd like for you guys to buy it." And I said, "I don't have any money." And he said, "Well, we're going to sell it." And there was somebody wanted to try to quarry the soft limestone out of it. I heard that General Motors wanted to buy it to put their pickups on top of the precipices to take pictures of them. And somebody wanted to turn it into an off-road vehicle park and lots of things. Anyway, so I was talking to the chairman of my board and I said, well, this thing's for sale. I don't have the money for it. He said, "Go buy it. You'll have the money for it." So I went and made an offer on it, and a month later I had the money to buy the fairly small piece of land, 390 acres, but it's been one of the best things I ever did. So I'm really, really happy about that. And again, that's another partnership. It's managed by the Department of Wildlife and Parks here, and they're doing a great job running that for the people of Kansas. It's a state park open to the public. Next slide, please. I mentioned energy. In fact, I'm going to skip on past that one. I've talked enough about that. I want to talk just a little bit about conservation funding in Kansas, if I could. The Nature Conservancy, like all nonprofits, has always got their eye on the dollar sign. And in Kansas, we have this incredible natural resource base. And when I say natural resources, I don't mean just wildlife and water. I mean oil and gas. And we've got just an outstanding natural resource base, principal of which is the rich soils and grasslands that we have for agriculture. In Kansas, we have also done if I may say, and by the way, I'm a former Assistant Secretary of Wildlife and Parks, so I'm culpable all in this. I worked for Bill Graves when he was governor way back when. Some of you might remember him. And so as a former Assistant Secretary, I take some of the responsibility for this, but we have never invested in conserving our natural resources, in particular our water, like it merits. We have these incredible resources that the people of Kansas are so blessed to have, but frankly, I feel that we have not taken good care, we have not stewarded them as well as we should, and we have not provided people the benefits to them as well as we should. I'll talk just a little bit more about that if I could. Go ahead. You can go ahead. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So this started about 3 years ago when Mike Beam was still with the Livestock Association. And he and I were having this conversation about the fact that Kansas leaves money on the table for conservation every year because we don't have the ability to match it. For agricultural conservation programs, conservation easements, there are programs, federal programs for this that we can't capture because we don't have our own source of money. At that time, I think 27 states had a program to capture these federal monies for these kind of conservation programs, Kansas being one that did not. So Mike and I started having a conversation with a handful of his trustees with the Ranchland Trust and a handful of my trustees with the Nature Conservancy, and that conversation went absolutely nowhere for about a year. And then we decided that what we were trying to do was too narrowly focused, that it needed to think about conserving water in an agricultural context as well as in an environmental context. And would somebody tell me when I get down to 5 minutes so I can shut up? Two pieces of wisdom I'd share. One's from my dad, who said, there's never a better time to fix a mistake like right now. So that's what this is about. And the other one is from my grandfather, who I think was parroting Will Rogers, who said, don't miss a good chance to shut up. So I'm going to try to keep both those in mind as I go along. So Mike and I started talking to some other folks in the outdoor recreation and in the conservation field. And we ended up with a list of concerns that looks like this right here. We know that we have land conservation that we can do better at. We're way remiss in water. I think the fact that 3 out of every 4 stream miles in Kansas, 3 out of every 4 miles, is impaired for one or more of the designated human uses: drinking water, livestock water, fishing, body contact recreation. We're better people than that. We can do better than that. I'm embarrassed that on my watch some of that has happened. So, but we can do better. Recreation. We've got a little poll that I'll talk about in a minute. Outdoor recreation is more important to Kansans than probably any of us, including me, afforded. And the simple quality of life things. Outdoor recreation is important to our economy. I was going through Junction City, of all places, on the opening day of pheasant season, stopped in a convenience store, and this is in Junction City. And I grew up in Ellsworth and Pratt County. Remember where there's pheasants? There's no pheasants in Geary County to speak of. The woman who ran the store said, this weekend and the next weekend are our most profitable business days of the entire year, all tied to outdoor recreation. Is important to us. And then lastly, education and understanding. As we become a more and more urban population, I think we have a greater challenge at informing people about natural resource conservation and the opportunities to benefit from it. Next slide, please. So we did this poll of Kansans. We didn't do it. We had it done by a pollster who was proud to tell us they had both Republicans and Democrats on their staff. I don't know why that's important, but I guess it is. And here's what they said to us. These are the sort of the top line messages out of this poll. Being in nature is important to us. This was cross-cutting across rural and urban residents both. Positive towards legislators. I know you guys don't care about this. Positive towards legislators who will support increased spending for conservation. They said what they said was, we're more likely to vote for you if you support increased spending on conservation. And no surprise to this group, water conservation. Their priorities were, the first 3 priorities were water. You want to guess the third one? It was water too. Water is what everybody's worried about. So you guys have it right here. Next slide, please. So we dug into the detail a little bit. What do you want in these realms? And here's some of the things that we found. People are worried about the status of our ground and surface water for human use. They're also worried about our soil health, where some of our farming practices, my family's farming practices, for years have been mining the nutrients of the soil. I heard somebody mention something about dam operation in here earlier, that our dams and our watersheds are being silted in. We have erosion that we don't need. Flood prevention will always remain on people's radar screen. Related to water, though, is better management of our grazing lands, of rangelands. And then people are still concerned, believe it or not, about declining species and habitats. All right, next slide, please. Particularly when you get close to urban areas, but not solely isolated to urban areas, people are really interested in access to the outdoors. Kansans lack access to the outdoors because we're a private land state. I'm proud to say that when I was at the Department of Wildlife and Parks, we started the Walk-In Hunting Areas program, which took public hunting access from about 330,000 acres in 1999 to now I think it's about 1.3 million acres, all at the invitation and to the benefit of private landowners. So people want more access to the outdoors, and I'm not going to dwell on this, except for that last one. I want to go back to the lady in the convenience store in Junction City. The economic development and the employment opportunities that go with it are not small. Next slide, please. We're working, I mentioned the Rattlesnake Creek Basin, where we're working with farmers there to help deploy irrigation efficiency technology, soil moisture monitors. If any of you who aren't irrigators may not know this, there's stuff out, you know, when an irrigator doesn't have technology, he or she has this choice. They look at their soil, they might take a spade and stick a shovel in the ground, they make a decision, a somewhat arbitrary decision about whether it's time to turn the system on again. One guy I know said when I drove down the road and I saw dust behind my pickup, I figured it's time to turn on the system again. It's the best science you got, right? We bought a bunch of soil moisture monitors to be deployed in the Rattlesnake Creek Basin. It's in Stafford County. For those of you who don't know, the issue is this. Quivira National Wildlife Refuge, the Department of the Interior, has a senior water right there. Almost all the irrigators have junior water rights to that. The irrigation is slightly over appropriated such that the National Wildlife Refuge can't get its water right when it really needs it. But the water is there. And we believe that with a little bit of efficiency, a lot of efficiency in irrigation, with some good water management on the refuge, and a little bit of application of science and technology, and we also are in the process of getting rid of about 6,000 acres of trees, mostly salt cedars along Rattlesnake Creek there. We think that we can keep the irrigators making a good profit, keep the National Wildlife Refuge system operating, and not have a lawyer make a penny out of the deal. No offense to anybody who's a lawyer in here. And not have the state have to regulate or the Department of the Interior have to sue the state of Kansas. This is the kind of solution we're looking for here. So those kind of things, irrigation efficiency is really important. One other little story I'll tell you, we're also working down in the Red Hills where in an area of about 2 million acres in Oklahoma and Kansas, eastern red cedars are they are an alien, they're not an alien, they're native, but they are taking over the world. Depending on whose study you believe, eastern red cedars are taking between $500 million and $1 billion a year out of the economy of every one of those little tiny towns down in the Red Hills. And so we get that back by changing the way we graze and changing the way we burn. And there are a lot of ranchers down there way ahead of the Nature Conservancy on this, but we're trying to help with that. It's really expensive because if you let eastern red cedars get established, then you don't have enough grass to carry a fire. And if you don't have enough grass to carry a fire, you can't kill the eastern red cedars. And so you correct that by taking the cattle off that land for a while, let the fuel burn up so you can kill the cedars. That costs money. And some of those ranchers are going to have to help to get that back. But it's not just in their interest. This is a public interest. This is economy. By the way, if we get rid of those same eastern red cedars, we take the lesser prairie chicken back from the brink of being listed under the Endangered Species Act. And we bring back a lot of streams as well. That's enough. I'll go on to the next slide. So here is just some samples of federal programs that we are unable to fully capture. And there are lots of private grants out there. There's lots of money that Kansas can't capture for the benefit of Kansans because we don't have our own money. Land and Water Conservation Fund was recently authorized at $900 million a year. The RCCP under USDA is 300 million. USDA is 450, or ASAP is 450 million. I'm sorry if you don't know the alphabet soup. I'll be glad to tell you what they are at some other time. North American Wetlands Conservation Act, $60 million a year. We're doing a pretty good job of capturing that, actually. And several other programs that would benefit private landowners as well as the people of Kansas more broadly that we are unable to capture. Lots and lots of money, billions of dollars. Next slide, please. So I know that cross-border envy sometimes works in politics. And in Missouri, they've been doing this for a long time. They've had their own conservation funding source. It generates about $90 million a year. Arkansas generates between $40 and $60 million a year through a conservation funding tax. Minnesota, now Minnesota's in a different league. You know, they're in a different league, got a lot more people, but they're generating a ton of money from a 3/8 of 1% sales tax. Nebraska, for gosh sakes, is ahead of us. Nebraska, the Huskers, I can hardly stand that. $320 million that they've generated through, I'm sorry, I hope there's no Nebraskans in here that are mad at me now. Anyway, the point is, states around us are doing this. It's not impossible. It's not hard. I know fiscal times are difficult, but we need to find a way to benefit Kansans by funding conservation the way it should be, starting with water, Mr. Chairman. Yeah. Next slide, please. So there's lots of studies out there. They run anywhere from, I think the Blue Ribbon Task Force said we needed $55 million for water. There's a couple studies done in the 90s that said even back then we needed over 100 million. It's a lot of money. We're not going to do it all at once, but we can chip away at it. What do voters say in this poll that we had done for us? Voters said, here's how we would support paying for it. A portion of existing sales taxes, gaming taxes, or a slight increase in sales taxes, especially if you focus it on sporting goods and outdoor equipment. That's what your constituents said that they would support. And I think there's one more slide. Yeah, that's my daughter Evie right there before she was 11. Anyway, that's all I have, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this. Yeah.
Thank you, and we appreciate it. So now we open up for questions. Questions? Oh, come on. Representative Schmidt.
Yes, sir. Mr. Mannis, thank you for that presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The eastern red cedar, what is it how do you get rid of that then? What's the process?
Fire is the cheapest way. Even prescribed fire costs between $8 and $40 an acre to do if you have a moderate infestation of eastern red cedars. But fire is the main way. Sometimes they will become so dense, closed canopy we call it, that there's no grass under them, so there's no fuel to ignite them. They don't ignite that easily. In that case, the next choice is mechanical clearing. You've seen skid steers and tractors with the saws and the clippers on the front. That's very expensive. Then you're up in the hundreds of dollars per acre to do that. And I actually know of a couple places in the Red Hills where they use helitorches. It's basically a helicopter with a machine in it that shoots ping pong balls through it full of napalm and ignites the trees from the top down. That's super expensive. But the way to get rid of them effectively is to manage grazing so that there's enough fuel to kill them when they're knee high and shorter. And, you know, in the Flint Hills, a lot of the Flint Hills does a pretty good job of keeping cedars out. We know about fire in the Flint Hills. If you get to the Smoky Hills where my family is, or the Red Hills, some of that fire culture has died out. And so if you go 10 years and don't burn, you start to get a problem that you have to control in a more expensive manner. Did I answer your question? Yes. All right, thank you.
Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good information. Could you share with us your contact information? I didn't see anything on a PowerPoint or anything for that.
I apologize, yeah. What's the best way for me to do that?
We'll give it to Tony and he'll send it to all the committee.
Certainly, be glad to chat further with anybody.
Representative Fairchild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned the Rattlesnake Creek issue, and I represent that area in Stafford County. And
sorry.
Yeah, it's been a big issue, but you mentioned the conservation efforts. I was just wondering if you found that farmers in that area have been receptive to the conservation ideas.
thanks for raising that, because if I didn't mention that, I screwed up. There's a group of farmers down there involved in a group called WaterPack. I know you know about them, who are extremely progressive. They are all willing to fix this problem. They can't go out of business in the process. And so, yeah, the farmers have been really forward-leaning. They've given us access to their land to do things like get rid of, I think we're at 4,700 acres of salt cedars now. They're willing to modify the way they farm, get rid of end guns on their center pivot systems, put in soil moisture monitors. And so, yeah, they are the #1 part of the solution down there. Be glad to visit with you in a lot of detail about that if you like.
Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Mannis. I just want to say thank you also for your work, especially with Kansa Prairie and Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve. Those are two of my favorite places in the state, and I didn't realize that you guys were part of that, so that's really wonderful. I have two questions. The first is, you mentioned that 3 of 4 streams in the state is impaired for beneficial use, and I was just wondering what the cause of that, or what some of the primary causes of that are. Is it obstruction, or?
Well, if you're talking about the middle section of the Smoky Hill, it would be my family, who farms along the Smoky Hill there. I mean, there's lots of things. And I grew up playing in the Smoky Hill. The city of Ellsworth had a substandard sewage plant the whole time I was growing up, which is probably part of the reason I am the way I am. But, you know, the farming practices that my grandfather used, frankly, didn't do as good a job. He was a great farmer, too. Made a good living at it and took the best care of the soil he knew how. But his practices put things in the river that don't need to be there and we don't want there. So.
Got it. Thank you so much. And then second question, I know we kind of briefly glanced at the federal programs, and for those programs you had the amount of funding available, but what do the matching funds look like for that? If the state is interested in investing in those programs, what are those dollar amounts? And if our committee, if one of the things we're interested is increasing efficiency or possibly conservation of water sources in Kansas, what are programs specifically available for that purpose? Thank you.
Yeah, there are probably a lot of them that I don't know about, but the USDA, the conservation title of the Farm Bill, probably has, people don't think of that as a water benefiting source of funds, but it is, because most of what we can do to improve water quality in Kansas has to do with how we farm. And there's a ton of help in the conservation title of the Farm Bill to do that. Some we can capture, some we cannot. And you asked about, I think you asked about the match. It varies from program to program, from as little as 25% landowner contribution to, I think some of them are 50% and maybe more. And maybe somebody, yeah, Dan, you may know better than I do about that.
It varies by program. We'll cover that on Monday. How's that sound?
Dan Meyerhoff with the Kansas Association of Conservation Districts. They and Farm Bureau are both part of the coalition I mentioned earlier. So yeah, it varies a lot. You know, ASEP can be as little as 12.5% from the landowner, up to at least 50%, and there may be some that are higher than that.
That's great information. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Further questions? I have one. You mentioned Rattlesnake Creek, and I applaud your efforts there. Now, you're talking about helping with the irrigation practices and the soil probes. Are you doing a cost share with them, or is your organization furnishing the probes?
For right now, we just bought them.
You did.
Yeah, and the phreatophyte is what my staff calls them. They're salt cedars and other trees that suck water out. That we paid for with a grant that we matched from USDA. So far, the landowners have a ton of investment in that, but those two initiatives have been pretty much ours.
Okay, thank you. Further questions? One more. Right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a follow-up to that. Are you also doing types of education around the use of the soil moisture probes, or are you largely just kind of helping farmers implement those practices? Just kind of curious, for long-term, how can we duplicate those efforts across the state? Thank you.
Farmers and ranchers, yeah, thanks for that question. Farmers and ranchers learn best from farmers and ranchers. So the Nature Conservancy is not really doing any education around those. In fact, I don't really know the complete answer to your question, but the manufacturers and the people who distribute those things probably do most of the technical education on them. I wouldn't know which end of the soil probe to stick in the ground, probably. So, anyway.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
See no further question. Mr. Mannis, thank you very much for coming. We appreciate the presentation, and again, thank you.
Thanks for the invitation. Thank you.
Next on our program today will be an update from the Corps of Engineers, the Federal State Partnerships, Ginger Neiman Harper, the Community Planner for the United States Army Corps of Engineers. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the committee. You gave me a tall order anyways in summarizing the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in 20 minutes or less. And then I get here and I'm following Mr. Mannis, who is probably much more funny than I am, so I apologize. My name is Ginger Neiman Harper. I'm a community planner with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Kansas City District. It's a pleasure to be here this morning to give you just a high-level overview of our district and some of the USACE missions around the country. Next slide. So this is a general map that shows you where we are as a Corps of Engineers, both nationally and across the globe. Kansas City District is part of the Northwest Division headquartered in Portland, but you see we do have 9 divisions and 43 districts delivering the USACE mission both nationally and globally. Next slide. These are our primary mission areas. You'll see that we do serve a wide variety of missions, and some of these, in addition to the water resource mission, are in Kansas. We have military missions, contingency operations, research and development, which includes energy, environment, and water resource, international and interagency, geospatial support. We do have a real estate mission. We serve as the real estate agent, essentially, for DOD. And then in the middle there, you'll see our Civil Works mission, which will be the one that most closely intersects with the work that your committee's doing and where we have a fairly large footprint in Kansas. Next slide. So to bring it in a little closer, this is the Kansas City District area of responsibility. We do have 18 multi-purpose dams managed by our district in 4 states, Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, and Nebraska. 2 of these have hydropower as a mission, and 1 has an irrigation purpose. 9 reservoirs are in the Kansas and Osage River basins operated by the Kansas City District, and then there are 8 reservoirs in the Arkansas Basin operated by the Tulsa District. So Kansas does have 2 core districts that serve the state. We also manage 498 miles of the Missouri River from Rulo, Nebraska to the mouth at St. Louis. And we have more than 1,000 miles of both federal and non-federal levees in our area of responsibility. Next slide. So this is just to touch on some of those other mission areas I mentioned that are probably outside of the purview of this committee, but we do want to make sure you're aware that the Corps of Engineers is in the state. We do military design and construction to support all Kansas military installations. You'll see the picture there is the Command General Staff College. Recent projects include hangars and facilities for the KC-46A tanker mission, and then also some railhead improvements at Fort Riley. And then we also have some ongoing renovation work and historic preservation at Fort Leavenworth. We're also the lead district organization for the regulatory mission for the entire state of Kansas. And then we do have some environmental cleanup initiatives in the state where we support EPA Region 7 through technical review and assistance. We also provide the environmental support to all the military installations in the state. And then we actually do a lot of work nationwide in other states as well, our district does, for environmental cleanup. Next slide. What I'm going to focus on for the rest of my presentation is really our Civil Works mission. And this is probably the mission that you all are most familiar with, or what you think of with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. This slide will show you the many different types of Civil Works activities and projects that we've studied, designed, and built. And in many cases, we do still maintain these projects. We do have a Civil Works presence in all 50 states. We have extensive contact with the public, primarily through our lake projects, which I hope many of you have visited and enjoyed for the recreation opportunities there. You'll notice that we have 370 million visits a year, visitors a year, and that is actually more than the National Park Service. We like to boast about that fact. So the recreation is obviously very important, again, as Mr. Mannis had mentioned. The high priority missions you'll see are navigation, flood risk management and coastal storm damage reduction, and ecosystem restoration. Our other priorities then include the water supply. You'll notice that we have 153 lakes nationwide with water supply storage. We do have the hydropower, recreation, and then the emergency operations mission as well. Next slide. So to look a little bit more at our civil works portfolio, I mentioned that 498 miles of the navigation channel from Rouleau to St. Louis, and that's managed as part of the Bank Stabilization and Navigation Project, or the BSNP. Since 1980, the BSNP has been authorized to maintain a self-scouring 9-foot by 300-foot navigation channel. This is a self-scouring system. Like I said, there are no locks and dams on the Missouri River, unlike the Mississippi, which is a common misconception that we have with folks. But instead, we have a system of rock pile, dike, and revetment structures, or these river training structures that direct the flow and scour that channel out and stabilize the banks. We also have the Missouri River Fish and Wildlife Operation and Maintenance Funds, which are provided for the operation and maintenance of the BSNP in conjunction with the Missouri River Recovery Program, known as MRRP, which puts us in compliance with the 2018 Biological Opinion, the Environmental Impact Statement, and the Endangered Species Act. USACE coordinates with many Missouri River stakeholders and entities, including the congressionally authorized Mr. RIC, the Missouri River Recovery Implementation Committee, which is made up of more than 70 stakeholders to provide guidance and recommendations in carrying out the mission of the MRRP. We do also have a cultural and tribal effort within our civil works mission. We manage resources, including cultural and historical consultation with our tribal partners. We have archaeologists on staff that also maintain a collection of our artifacts and historically significant resources. Next slide. Where have we been? Some of our legacy projects with the Kansas City District. The legacy projects were the lakes and the Missouri and Kansas River levee projects constructed mostly in the latter half of the 20th century pursuant to major legislation there. The 18 district lake projects, we'll get into some of those benefits here on a subsequent slide, but it's an estimated $27 billion in cumulative damages that those lakes have prevented. The estimated 1,000 miles of federal and non-federal levees have prevented an estimated $11 billion in cumulative damages since construction. The Kansas City District lakes generate about 9.6 million visits per year and support estimated 5,600 local jobs. Water supply was added as a mission by the 1958 Water Supply Act, which allowed federal lakes to be constructed with water supply storage or have water supply added later through reallocation. The Kansas City District has 943,000 acre-feet of storage allocated to water supply. As Connie had mentioned in her presentation last week, we sell the storage space, we don't sell the water. This water supply storage serves millions of people in eastern Kansas, including the growing corridor along I-70 to include cities like Topeka, Lawrence, and Kansas City. And in fact, 60% of the municipal water supply in Kansas comes from Corps of Engineers reservoirs. Next slide. Some of our current projects that we are working on, these are construction projects that are currently being done. You'll see the top left picture there is the Elwood and St. Joe levee projects, the R417, 460, and L455 levee systems. That's about a $71 million project. It's a levee raise project to improve the reliability and safety of those systems near St. Joseph, Missouri, and Elwood and Wathena, Kansas. The investment protected by those levee systems is estimated at $2.3 billion. Going clockwise, the Kansas City levees, that picture is of the CID and Armourdale units, but the entire KC levees project is about a $529 million project. This is one of our mega projects that our district is responsible for. It's modifications of existing levee structures that protects about 32 square miles of urban, industrial, and commercial and residential zones. That protects about $25 billion in investment, 94,000 plus jobs, and 7,000 structures. The Topeka Levy is a $29 million project that's just about ready to wrap up, protecting $2.6 billion in industrial, commercial, and residential investments. They're modifying about 43 miles of the existing levee structure, including a 3,600-foot flood wall and 10 pump stations along the levee. And then finally, the Manhattan Levy is a $30 million project. It's a levee raise that was realized after actually the 1993 flood. It's to reduce potential flood damage to about $2 billion in residential, industrial, and commercial investment, and also a lot of life safety concerns behind the Manhattan Levy for downtown Manhattan. Next slide. So to speak to some of our current projects that we kind of call the next generation of water infrastructure in the country, we have two current projects that I'd encourage you to either find more about. We can come back and present at a future time on either of these. The Kansas River Basin study, there on the left, is a very powerful multi-purpose study that can improve flood risk, system and project operations, sediment management, water supply availability, ecosystem restoration, which includes the blue-green algae that you see the picture thereof. And the study will really lay out an infrastructure strategy for the basin. We're working with the Kansas Water Office and Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks on this study. And we're hoping that at the end of the day, there'll be kind of a roadmap for water resources for the next 50 years in the basin of where we can leverage both USACE and state funding to identify and prioritize those projects. The picture there as well is Tuttle Creek during the 2019 flood when the Outlet Works released 30,000 CFS on May 31st. So that's the picture there. The Lower Missouri River Flood Risk and Resiliency Study on the right, that will develop a system plan for the lower 735 miles of river. This is a 4-state effort starting at Sioux City to the mouth in St. Louis. So Kansas, through the Water Office, has joined with Iowa, Nebraska, and Missouri on this project. There are repetitive damages along the length of the river, including some in Kansas, and we're hoping to come up with a plan to alleviate some of that flood risk and provide system resiliency. The pictures there from the top left, that's the Henry Pole Levee on March 27, 2019 in Atchison County, Kansas. The next picture is of R500. That's a levee system near in Donovan County near White Cloud. That was one of our federal levees that was breached during the 2019 flood. So you can see some of the extent of the damage there. And then the most interesting picture there is our poor fruit stripe truck. That poor truck driver was using his GPS in the summer of 2019 near Brunswick, Missouri. It did not serve him well as it kept taking him down roads that were actively flooding. So he found a road that wasn't flooding and then quickly learned that it was indeed a levee, which began flooding both in front and behind him. And that picture was actually taken by our aerial reconnaissance team. They happened to be out and both helped rescue him. The truck did stay on that levee all summer, so I'm not sure about the condition of the fruit stripe gum. But, you know, just kind of pointing to the importance of flood risk and infrastructure, you know, that could have been a very, very bad deal had we not happened to have a helicopter in the air at the time. Next slide. As I mentioned, one of our most visible resources and where we interact with the public most are through our reservoirs. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the authorized purposes there. Next slide. So the benefits of our reservoirs to the state of Kansas include flood risk management through damages prevented, recreation, that tourism and spending surrounding the reservoirs, and then the water supply. We also have other benefits including fish and wildlife, water quality, and irrigation. And I'd be remiss if I did not mention, of course, that life safety is paramount in all of our reservoir operations. And Mr. Chairman, we did have a presentation last session, I believe it was the end of February 23rd of 2021, that went a little bit more into our water management operations at the federal reservoirs, and then also a little bit more about the emergency operations during the 2019 floods. So that would be there for your reference. Next slide. So let's look at some of the damages prevented by these reservoirs. I would note that in this particular table, the FY19 and 21 damages are adjusted numbers, but the cumulative, oh, sorry, next slide. There you go. So those FY19 and 21 numbers are adjusted for those dollars, but the cumulative column is not. That's just a cumulative of each year, so that's not an adjusted number, and it's still quite a large number. These projects were justified and authorized based on flood risk management benefits. And then these damages prevented is an annual calculation that we do based on what the natural flow of a river, so the Kansas or the Republican River, for example, would have been, and then what it was because of the reservoir's ability to hold water. Thus, the damages prevented by the project. Next slide. So to provide these benefits that I just mentioned, you might imagine that we have a significant flood storage capacity at these lakes. What I want you to take away from this slide, we prepared these during the 2019 flood. As you may all know, or may have experienced, these lakes held a large amount of water in 2019. And the lakes grew in size. And that is because the small dark blue bar that you see there at the bottom of those cups, which are proportional, that's what we call the multi-purpose pool. And that's where we're all used to seeing the lakes, and we're used to recreating on the lakes and enjoying them. All of that light blue storage is flood control storage. So that's when the lake grows and kind of fills that cup up when we hold back that water. So in the Osage River Basin here, which is Pomona, Melbourne, and Hillsdale, all of that water flows eventually through Truman Reservoir in Missouri, which is our largest flood storage capacity. About 71% of that basin's flood storage is there, but we have 5.65 million acre feet of flood storage capacity in the Osage Basin. And then on the next slide, you'll see the lower 4 reservoirs in the Kansas Basin, which have the combined flood storage capacity of 3.45 million acre feet. And you can see that Tuttle Creek there is really the workhorse on the flood control for that basin. But again, that light blue, we want to keep that empty. We want that to be there when we need it and when we need to operate those flood control operations. Next slide. So this system of reservoirs is just one tool in our toolbox for flood risk management. It's really an interagency flood risk management effort, and this effort is state-led. You'll see that we think of the state as our partner rather than a customer. And really, the state sets the priority for coordinated interagency federal support. To the right, you see that cycle of a disaster, essentially, where there's the preparation and training, the getting ready for the event, which is the action taken before the event. You have the event, and you move into the response, the flood fight, the actions taken during the initial impact. And then you go into recovery, the getting back out on our feet, those actions taken after. And then in that final, the mitigation, that's where we attempt to drive down the risks and come up with measures that will prevent a disaster, reduce its chances of happening, or reduce the damaging effects. So USAID interacts with different agencies in the state during each of these 4 kind of cycle time periods. We support all efforts in flood risk management, and some of the cities that we work most closely with or have most recently include Topeka, Manhattan, Ottawa, Kansas City, and Salina. Next slide, please. But really the responsibility for disaster and risk management around flooding and other disasters, it involves everybody from the federal, state, local, and then down to the actual individual. Last week, you heard a little bit about the National Flood Insurance Program here in the state being administered through DWR. That's an individual way to drive down the risk. The authority to determine how land is used in floodplains, that's something that comes at the state and local level, but can definitely have an impact on the effectiveness of a federal program or federal infrastructure like a levee or a reservoir. So all of these pieces and this stair step kind of interact with each other to drive down that risk, but there is a residual risk that still remains. And so that's one of our goals, is to just educate the public and improve the public's knowledge of that risk. Next slide. One of the ways we do this is through our dam safety program. I do some work with them through risk communication. And our dam safety program is very robust. As you can imagine, we do operate 9 of the dams in Kansas. They are the very large ones and high consequence, of course. And so operations and maintenance at our dams is something that we do on an annual, daily, and periodic basis through inspections and assessing that risk, understanding the risks, and then prioritizing the investments that need to be made. This is aging infrastructure, so those inspections are very, very important. And one of these inspections is pictured there. This was back in the fall of 2021 when we went to Pomona. and had a complete dewatering of the outlet works there and inspected everything. Next, we bring awareness to the risk through annual training at our project, and then also periodic training with our project and our local partners through tabletop exercises. Some of you may have participated in those if you participate in your emergency management functions in your community. And then finally, we look at risk management, and we've done some work with consequence elicitation interviews to try to learn more about our emergency planning partners on the ground and how we can better assist them, because that's one thing during an actual emergency, your local emergency managers are going to do things like issue evacuation orders and really be the go-to people there. We also have the National Inventory of Dams, which is a tool that we are updating with new things like a flood inundation mapping that will be available to the public and also to our local emergency managers at all times, just to keep that line of communication and education open. Next slide. But disasters do happen, flooding will happen, emergencies will happen, and so USACE does have a disaster response mission. PL 8499 is our principal authority, it's just the title of the law for our disaster preparedness and response. This is all hazards planning. We do flood fighting, technical and direct assistance, providing loans of pumps and sandbagging machines. We can also provide sandbags. We provide post-flood response, advanced measures, rehabilitation of flood control works, and then we can also supply emergency drinking water in the case of drought and a contaminated water source. One thing to note on that slide is that USAID's assistance is always supplemental to state and local efforts. So we will follow KDEM's lead, and requests are filtered up through the counties and through KDEM to get response from the Corps. And the final slide just gives you a little picture of our flood fight supplies. Being in the Midwest, between us and a couple of our other districts like Rock Island, we're kind of the hub of flood fight supplies. We have a little more than 4 million sandbags, 205 super sacks, 25 pumps with about 7,500 feet of hose. We do have 6 sandbag machines, 3 manual and 3 automatic. You can guess which ones get requested first there. But those were deployed in the 2019 flood in various communities around. I think we assisted about 14 different counties in 2019 through either technical or direct assistance. And then we have about 2,500 linear feet of the HESCO barrier, which is kind of the big fence-like structure that you fill with sand. Next slide, please. So that is a very brief, high-level overview of a very large federal agency, but one that we feel that does a really important mission in Kansas and in the region. I would be happy to answer any questions today, and if I am not a subject matter expert on them, we can definitely arrange for some of the other subject matter experts to come in and give you additional presentations on subjects that you're most interested in. Mr. Chairman, I'd also say that we did have a few presentations at the Governor's Water Conference in November. So if those presentations are available online, I haven't actually checked that, but those might be something your committee could reference, or we can also modify those to come back in front of the committee. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. That great information. A lot of it very quickly, obviously. Some of the information you presented, the numbers and so forth, would you be willing to share some of that, of your written testimony with the committee?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Get it to Tony and he will distribute it, put it on the S drive for the committee. Mm-hmm. Questions of the committee? Representative Vaughn, surprise, surprise.
I have a lot of questions. It was such a great presentation, but I will limit it. Thank you, Ms. Neiman-Harper. That was really informative. So, of course, I've heard about the sedimentation in Tuttle Creek. I didn't really realize at the time, though, that it's also one of our primary flood control dams. So I was just curious, do high levels of sedimentation decrease the flood control capacity? And then I was also wondering if you would maybe be able to provide a brief update about the water injection dredge project. I think we've heard a lot of excitement around the infrastructure bill and potential funding for that. I'm just wondering if you heard any more about the progress of that. Thank you.
Sure. Well, we don't have infrastructure funding results yet. So we have not been told what has been funded or hasn't been funded. So that's something we can definitely keep the committee updated on. And I know that we will be talking to the water office, obviously, about that as well. As far as the sediment in the lakes, it really depends on the project and kind of where that sediment falls out. John Shelley is a sediment expert and we're lucky to have him at the Kansas City District. He would be able to, I think Chairman Highland had indicated that sediment might be something that you all would be more interested in learning about, and he could definitely talk through some of those particulars as far as sediment. But the important thing to note is that not much of the flood, as on a whole, not much of the flood control storage is affected by the sediment as much as some of the other multi-purpose uses.
Good to know. Thank you.
Would you give me that name again?
Sure, it's John Shelley. And Chairman Highland, you have my contact information. Tony has that, so I'd be happy to help coordinate that. We are a big agency, and so I'm happy to coordinate any requests you have.
Okay, thank you for that. Representative Mannis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you did an awesome job packing an hour and a half worth of data into 20 minutes. Somewhat of a hypothetical question because in my area, it directly affects the Ark River, which is in the Tulsa district. Yet we're seeing some uranium contamination coming into northwest Kansas, which is in your region. You deal mainly with quantity of water. I want to talk a little bit about quality. Has there been any studies to see if we could capture that water coming out of a state which is contaminated and try to treat it so that each of the local units of government downstream do not have to treat it individually? I know it's somewhat of a hypothetical question, but I see what's going on in the Ark River. If we could fix it before it moves farther across the state, and I realize that's in the Tulsa district, but just give us an idea what you might consider.
You know, so for the Corps to work with a local municipality or the state, you know, it is a partnership and cost share agreement for a study or a project or something like that. We do have the Kansas River Basin study. I don't know if that has been looked at particularly because the Kansas River Basin would obviously cover the northwest part of the state. It actually goes a little bit into Colorado. So I can definitely make a note of that, and we could get an update to see if that study is looking at that particular issue. I'm not aware of any active studies, though, looking at the contamination or the water quality or the treatment of that at this time, though.
Thank you very much.
Further questions? Representative Croft.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just real quick, infrastructure projects, you mentioned that up there, Fort Riley. Can you connect me later on with somebody else that can give me a bit more update on that, where we're at and what's going on?
On the military construction side?
Right.
Sure.
More
absolutely.
specifically, just about the infrastructure. Sorry, I'll just turn mine off. More specifically about the railheads, I've seen all the work that's going on out there, and I know that in the 90s we did the mobility requirement study, bottom-up review, and that paid for most of this. I'm just curious if that's the project we're still doing and what's the status on doing that and how much more we can expect. I didn't see anything about McConnell on there, so I'd be interested to see what's going on. I know this is about water, so I'm trying to keep it there. The Sunflower Army ammunition plant cleanup, any update, whether now or later is fine, because I know that may not be in your field. But specifically on your slide, I think it was slide 25, you talked about the disaster response tabletop exercises. Who gets to attend that?
Sure. So those around our dam safety program, this past year we did something a little. The damn jokes write themselves, I tell you. Our dam safety program did this last year, and there was a little bit different twist on them this past year. We really focused on the risk communication aspect because a lot of times a tabletop exercise will kind of go through a scenario, but we always get to the part about how you're going to communicate it to somebody, and we just kind of say, yeah, we'll get the word out. And so this past year, we really worked a little bit more on what messages folks would actually put out, what means they would do it. The Corps itself is doing a lot of work on vulnerable populations. You know, one of the things around reservoirs is you have a lot of seasonal folks that are recreating around there. They may not be as in tune to the local emergency management officials. So we have a lot of local emergency management officials, cities, counties, folks like that, as well as our project staff and our emergency management folks attend those. If you're interested in something like that, we do a series of them each year based on the project, and we could get you more information if you're interested in what's shared during those.
Just to follow, Mr. Chair. And it sounds like that's a great exercise. It sounds like something that maybe leadership of this committee might want to be involved in. I figure the more he gets involved there, less work he gives us. So, just kidding. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'm going to single you out. Further questions? Seeing none. Ginger, thank you. That was a great presentation. We really appreciate it. And both presenters today, Rob and Ginger, great presentations. Thank you very much. The committee thoroughly enjoyed it. We have a lot more questions coming as we move along. Thank you very much. Anything else for the good of the committee? Seeing nothing, we are adjourned. Just a second.
Do we want to do a water one reminder?
Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to give a quick reminder. I know Tony sent out a second email, but wanting to get confirmed head count on the Water One tour. So if you have not RSVP'd, I might come find you and just see if you're available to attend as we try and get all of that coordinated. So thank you so much, Mr. Chair.
That's important for the committee. We have seen the western part of the state and their particular problems. Now we get to see a true large municipality, how they handle water. So to complete your education on the committee, that's what we're trying to do here as we move forward. If nothing further, thank you all. We are adjourned.